I've been playing Avowed recently, and while I work, I've been listening to other creators share their thoughts on the game. A lot of these creators seem to spout the same few talking points over and over, or simply state things that I don't feel are true about the game. Honestly, I've been dissatisfied with the conversation about Avowed, and while I rarely talk about games that are new, I feel like I need to throw my 2 cents into the ring because I feel some creators, including those that I like, just aren't getting it right. First thing I feel like a lot of creators seem to not understand is this game is set in the Pillars of Eternity cinematic universe. Or if they do know this, they simply breeze through that part and get right back to comparing Avowed to Skyrim. I feel like that's a fundamental flaw that poisons the rest of the review. I'm a big CRPG fan, and I played the hell out of Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. It took me about 70 something hours to beat, and I fell in love with the world of Eora as I journeyed through the Deadfire archipelago. My character was a pale elf archer from the White That Wins, named Priscilla. I tried really hard to mimic that character in Avowed, but due to reasons we will mention later, I abandoned that for a spellcaster. I have also played and beaten the Outer Worlds, and while at first that doesn't matter to Avowed, it will soon make sense why I feel the need to mention that I have engaged with Obsidian's 2 biggest recent games. Yes, Grounded and Pentiment exist, and have come out between here and there, but I haven't played either of those titles, and to be completely honest, I didn't know they were made by Obsidian because they feel so far detached from previous Obsidian titles. So all this yapping is meant to say that I have engaged with both the lore of Eora itself and, as a studio, played enough games from Obsidian to feel like I have a strong foundation to criticize Avowed, something I feel like some reviewers are missing. The reason I bring all this up is to say that a lot of reviewers are comparing this game to the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. The phrase I keep hearing is, it's Obsidian's version of Skyrim. I understand that most of the time this is in good faith, but it's like comparing a garage rock band to the likes of Metallica. Skyrim exists so far above the competition that if you use it as a basis for comparison against any other game, nothing can stand against it. So taking Avowed and holding the two side by side is a fundamental flaw that instantly undermines a review. Instead, I believe a far more accurate review should compare Avowed to its predecessors, meaning Pillars of Eternity 2, The Outer Worlds, and yes, maybe even sort of Grounded. The reason many people compare it to Skyrim is because you are a person with a quest walking around a continent who can hold a sword and sling spells. You have companions that follow you around, the game can be played in third or first person, and a very, very long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, Obsidian and Bethesda made a game from the same franchise. But both of these studios have turned over so many workers that they're barely, if any, of the same people who were in that era. So that point is basically moot, in my opinion. Unfortunately, it's far easier to say it's a Skyrim clone than it is to say it's the lore of Pillars of Eternity with the gameplay of Outer Worlds, because very few people know what that means, but everyone knows Skyrim. For example, I rarely heard Dragon Age Veilguard being compared to anything other than the previous Dragon Age titles. This is frustrating because now a viewer is comparing Avowed to one of the greatest and highest selling RPGs of all time, and not giving Avowed a fair shake. So I purposefully went in with the viewpoint of comparing it to its brothers and sisters, not the Joneses down the block with the pretty grass and nice cars. So does any of that matter? Does this different viewpoint suddenly make Avowed a 10 out of 10? Unfortunately, no. Obsidian made some mistakes that are absolutely worth criticizing. First and foremost, Avowed either should have not been a Pillars of Eternity game, or should not have been a first-person RPG. Let me explain. But first, please hit that like and subscribe button. If you have any rebuttals or counter arguments, I would love to hear them down below. But even if not, a like or subscribe goes a long way for a small channel like mine. So, a valid criticism that a lot of reviewers are tossing around is that this game is incredibly lore heavy, and the NPCs love to lore dump and talk and talk and talk. As someone who's played Pillars of Eternity 2, I can tell you that this is a selling point for that franchise, not a bad thing. A lot of people praise Pillars for its deep and sprawling lore with the gods, Eora itself, the many factions and empires that populate this universe. Where Obsidian shoots himself in the foot is by making this a first-person RPG. This genre of game does not lend itself well to massive paragraphs of lore and endless yapping. Players of these types of games usually aren't looking for books to read. Otherwise, they'd be playing a CRPG or a visual novel. Even the promotional material advertises itself as a combat-first RPG, when in reality, a solid 40 to 50% of this game is talking. I'm not playing here either. It is unbelievable how much you stare at NPCs staring at you, blabbing on about everything under the sun. I personally love it, but I can understand the frustration of someone who maybe just got done playing Outer Worlds and jumps into Avowed, only to be accosted by loads of new nouns and lore dumps that aren't really explained, except through the in-dialogue encyclopedia. More on that later. I can foresee someone thinking that this is a fantasy version of the Outer Worlds, meaning a light-hearted romp through a fantasy land that primarily focuses on combat and some light RPG elements, when it's more like Pillars, just first person instead. I feel like Obsidian tried to double dip into the best of both worlds of a lore-rich CRPG like Pillars and a fast-paced first-person combat experience like Outer Worlds, and disappointed in both instead. Instead, this game should have been Pillars of Eternity 3: Avowed, an isometric CRPG that built on the best parts of Pillar 2 and refined and fixed the negative parts. Or this game should have had nothing to do with Pillars and stayed a first-person RPG with a tighter story that catered to brief moments of lore told through environmental and side quest style storytelling, much like its brother, The Outer Worlds. If none of that made any sense, or if I'm making a decent point, let me know down below either way, and we can talk about it. Go ahead and throw a like and subscribe in there too. So, drifting a little further away from the previous points, another thing a lot of people say is a bad thing that I briefly touched on is how the game already expects you to know a ton about the lore and says proper nouns as if you already know what they mean. The game highlights these terms in blue and lets you pause dialogue and read an encyclopedia entry to enlighten yourself on the definitions. This is the exact same problem a lot of people had with Final Fantasy XIII, my favorite Final Fantasy game. And yes, this is completely out of left field, I know, but hold on. The argument people made with that game is that a game's dialogue should be detailed enough to infer through context clues most things being discussed. I disagree. I think it is the writer's prerogative if they give you all the information, and if the writer is going for a tone of realistic casual conversation, like Avowed, then there's no way to convey every single relevant piece of information in a realistic way. For example, no one says, "Mr. Envoy of the Emperor of the Aether Empire, let's set our campfire by this Audra pillar, a pillar made of Audra, said to be a conduit for souls with mysterious origins, rumored to have a giant network of crystals underground." No, instead it's, "Hey leader, let's make camp at this pillar." If you want to know more about you being an envoy or what the Audra pillars are, there are optional dialogue choices that lead you to these more in-depth conversations if you choose. But it's far more natural to use shorthand or jargon in real life, and that's what Avowed is going for. I think the encyclopedia feature is perfect for some things you forget over time, but it's not like the game is forcing you to sit down and study or anything. However, to tie this back in with my previous point, by aiming for a first-person action RPG, you are naturally catering to an audience who are averse to monster-sized lore dumps. And nothing in the Pillars franchise is easy to grasp from shorthanded natural conversations. Again, I just feel like they chose the wrong genre of game to be in, or picked the wrong franchise to use. The Pillars franchise is naturally a lore dump CRPG type of game, so messing with any part of that formula throws everything off. So, in summary before moving on, I feel like other reviewers are comparing Avowed to the wrong franchise, and instead should have compared it to its predecessors, Pillars 2 and Outer Worlds. Obsidian made a mistake by picking either the wrong genre to put a Pillars game in, or chose the wrong franchise to make a first-person action RPG in. First-person RPGs are not a great genre to have massive ongoing lore dumps in, and the Pillars franchise naturally has tons of lore dumps. Okay, I think I've made my point as clear as I can, so let's move on instead of continuing to beat a dead horse. So next thing is the character creator. It's a great character creator, does its job, and I didn't have a hard time making a girl that I thought looked fitting for the adventure. Here's where things get shifty though. The mushrooms. I have seen a lot of creators whine about the mushrooms. I think they're crybabies and don't understand the game that they're playing or what Obsidian is trying to do. Unfortunately, guess what? Obsidian shoots themselves in the foot again by requiring a lore dump to even understand why you must have mushrooms all over your face. Do you see the problem with this game? Everything requires walls of text to even understand the basics. And not playing any previous Pillars game put a player in a lore deficit that previous knowledge would alleviate. So here's your lore dump. You are a race called a godlike, a creature chosen at birth by any god and given their favor in the womb. The thing birthed is called a godlike and has all kinds of physical deformities or alterations that indicate what god they're chosen or favored by. If you played past Pillars games, then you know that these things look insane, covered in horns, flesh flaps, glowy bits, and markings. A godlike rarely looks like a normal person. While it's not indicated early on what god chose you, you are still godlike. You're gonna look like a goober. You're playing a role-playing game, and this is the role the game wants you to play. Also, any complaint about the mushrooms is instantly undermined by the fact that you can toggle all this stuff off and LARP as a boring everyday RPG protagonist instead of enjoying something new. I really hate to be condescending here, but man, it's a creative decision that feels fresh and unique despite its initial off-putting nature. The devs want to tell a story about a fungus godlike. You're playing a game about a fungus godlike, so stop whining and open your mind up to new things. I've even heard complaining of some of the other races looking ugly and weird. My brother in Christ, that is the point. Kai is blue and scaly. He comes from a race of scaly, colorful people. Cry about it. Unfortunately, this decision doesn't appeal to the mass audience, and Obsidian is gonna pay the price for that. So those are my main things that I have against other creators' reviews. I feel a lot of creators are incorrectly judging the game on unfair metrics and comparing it to the wrong things. The lore is well maintained and avowed, but is far too deep for a simple RPG, and requires you to know too much to understand why the character creator is the way that it is. Let's move away from what other creators are talking about versus what they're not talking about. I've heard this from only a few different reviewers, but this is for me the biggest problem with this game, and that is the graphics. Let me start by saying this. I think the art direction is perfect. The bright color palette is very refreshing, and I'm very happy that they turned away from that boring grimdark nature they teased at first. However, this game is plagued by ghosting, artifacting, and frame rate issues. This game could have been so beautiful, but instead, the clouds look like gray chicken wire, hair looks like it hasn't crossed over the alpha stage of a game's life cycle, and the water looks like it was photoshopped in. And the ghosting problems are so bad that even in the shop menus, the words ghost and stay on screen when scrolling through the menus. Look at this, man. What an absolute shame. It wouldn't be a problem if it was here or there, but these technical problems are so frequent and so ugly and distracting that I have secondhand embarrassment for the technical devs. I refuse to believe that games have to be played on the craziest hardware in order to look good. Games should be designed for mid-level hardware, and I would say I am a hair over mid-level, and I could not get anything to look good with consistent frame rates. I played on two computers, one with a 4060 and one with a 3050, and it was the same story between both of them. It's such a shame, because the colors and flora are amazing to look at. The map is large and expansive, with all kinds of caves and temples and castles to explore and look at, and for the most part they look great. But as soon as you have water or hair in the frame, it's so off-putting. Or when you move around too fast and everything turns to blurry mud, even when the motion blur is turned off or on. Also, as a whole, everything in this game looks so soft, like blurry almost. Edges don't look sharp, instead they seem to blend from one object to the next. I shouldn't have to play doctor to repair your technical issues, and I refuse to normalize having to rely on frame generation and upscaling to fix your failures. because half the time, the frame gen and upscaling look like crap anyways. What shame to have this potential beauty squandered. Again, if this was an isometric CRPG like the other pillars, this would have been way less of a problem, but that's here nor there. So I think I've said all the negatives I want to say. Let's talk positive for a moment before we wrap this up. First though, link for my X is down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe and tell me your thoughts in the comments. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to mimic my ranged pale elf character from Pillars 2, and while I think I made a good rendition, I quickly had to switch from archer to spellslinger because oh my god, this is some of the most fun I've had in a first-person game in a while. The spells feel super responsive, and the sounds of the characters screaming and the bass that's been cranked up to 11 is excellent. I do think the targeting of the AoE spells could use some work, and regular targeting sometimes doesn't feel right, but it's a great system overall. Your essence doesn't drain too fast, and essence replenishment comes often, so there's not much in the way of machine gun firing all your abilities. The melee feels great too, although I can't comment too much on it because I only ran around with the sword and shield for a little bit, and I never even touched the bow after the tutorial. There is a level gating mechanic, meaning you have to upgrade or find better gear often. Otherwise, the enemies can quickly begin to steamroll you. And while it's a little too punishing, I understand what they're trying to do. It's a dynamic way to force you to interact with the world around you. However, it's a little too resource demanding to feel any fun. I never really had too much of a problem. I just broke down every weapon and armor that I could to get large dumps of crafting resources to level up my gear. I wouldn't bother leveling up your starting equipment, just save up some money and buy the next tier. It is way faster that way. Again, I get what they were going for, but they could have tweaked it to make it more fun. This game also feels fantastic, meaning the movement and interacting with objects, the platforming and swimming. Movement feels excellent. I never felt like I was sluggish even underwater. The menus feel pretty snappy to navigate and everything sounds satisfactory. The music itself is nothing to write home about, but it's reactive to what you're doing. I noticed the music would naturally swell as I climbed up high vistas, and entering caves or dungeons would shift the music around to match a new tone. I can clearly tell the emotions that the music is trying to evoke, so it does the job, but there's no one track that really stood out to me. Real quick here near the end, there was some discussion about DEI stuff involved in this game. If a content creator is whining about this game being infected with DEI or LGBT stuff, you can safely ignore them. Yes, there are pronouns and body types, none of which matters past the character creator, and you'll never interact with again. Some characters look trans or non-binary because there are races that have dramatic variations in body styles, but there's no mission or character I've met who's trying to shove anything like that down your throat. That does remain to be seen as I reach the later half of the game, however. There are some themes about open borders destroying a nation, and the only mission that could be seen as forced DEI that I've come across is one in which you smuggle contraceptive and abortion meds under the police's nose. And when you figure out what you've been tricked into smuggling, there's no real way to roleplay as someone who is against those topics. Honestly, that was the only thing I felt that was a bit out of place. I think the biggest sin of this game is that there's nothing too memorable about it, except maybe the art style. Other than that, this game is going to be everyone's 7 out of 10, and they'll quickly forget about it and move on to the next hot topic. Probably Monster Hunter. What a shame. I have thoroughly enjoyed my time with Avowed, besides the comments I made earlier, especially with the graphics, and I was poised and ready for something great. But unfortunately, even as someone who loves Eora and the Pillars franchise, I can only agree with the reviewers who claim that this game is just a solid romp through a fantasy land, just a game to kill some time till a better game comes out, just an attempt at a Skyrim clone. I hate that they're right. For now, I'm still giving it my full attention, and I'm loving it as much as I can. The others may move on and forget this game, but I'm gonna remember Avowed just a little bit longer than everyone else, and wish for a game that could have been. Like and subscribe. Ropeburn out.